Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by a return guest, Dr. Michael Gurven. He is a professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He is also part of the Integrative Anthropological Sciences Unit and also Associate Director of the Evolutionary Anthropology and Biodemography Research Group there. And today we're going to talk about his book, 7 decades, how we evolved to live longer. And it's a very nice cover and nice book. So, Dr. Gurven, welcome back to the show. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. I thought we last talked a few years ago, and then you tell me it was 6 years ago. So I don't know. Time is flying by.
Yeah, I mean, 6 years ago, I also had a completely different haircut. So,
Hey, you still have hair. That's the important part.
Okay, yeah, I guess so. I guess so. Okay, so to get into the topic, because it's very interesting that last time we had a long interview and I asked you about your research, but we didn't touch, if I remember correctly, on the topic of longevity. So, what got you interested in studying that?
Yeah, I was trying to remember what we actually did talk about. I think it was more about social behavior and cooperation. And so, yeah, it's actually not that a distant, cry from thinking about cooperation, just because humans are so social, and one of the ways we're even able to make it to through childhood, much less to adulthood,
Yeah.
is through interdependence, relying on other people. There's so many different things that kind of make you unable to get up and walk, that make you sick, that make you not feel that great that day. And if we didn't have other people to help take care of us, we wouldn't make it. So this relationship just between cooperation and thinking about health, aging, and longevity was kind of a shoo-in, and it was always sort of in the back of my mind, starting some of the work in Paraguay, but especially once I started doing some work in Bolivia, thinking about aging, thinking about longevity. And yeah, that was basically what kind of got me started over, was it maybe 25 years ago or so. Yeah.
Okay, so I imagine that if we were to pick up a random person on the street and ask them, okay, so who do you think studies longevity? I guess that most people would say doctors, probably. But I mean, you're an anthropologist. So how do you study longevity as an anthropologist?
Yeah, good question. And it also is why, I was trying to situate this even with the book, right? There's no shortage of books out there on health, fitness, aging, and many of them, definitely take different tacks than I do. Like they're, a kind of checklist of things you could do to improve your life, to help live longer. And it helps having an MD to make that, more credible. And then other folks are, the molecular biologists that are sort of on the forefront to thinking about different, molecular pathways that can be altered in ways that can slow aging processes. And it's like, yeah, what do I have to contribute? And so, that's where I think what was interesting, I didn't really go into this thinking like, I'm a longevity researcher, but it was just by kind of working, that stereotype joke about the drunk kind of looking under the spotlight for their keys, yet their keys are on the other side of the room, but you're just looking where the spotlight is. And so I do think that there's a lot of great work out there on aging and longevity, focused on people just like you and me. And so my approach was just like, well, if we look to other populations around the world that haven't been really studied, let alone just the basic fact that, the kinds of populations I'm working with are the kinds of populations, the kinds of environments, the kinds of lifestyles that we've had up until just, not too long ago, certainly there could be something learned from all of that. And so that's been my approach. And it started off with a couple obvious things, right? Like it's easy to focus on disease perhaps than just thinking about aging and longevity writ large. So just the very fact that if we looked at people's hearts, if we looked at their brains and focused on heart disease, focused on diabetes, focused on Alzheimer's disease, uh, if we're finding that certain populations around the world just don't suffer from these diseases or suffer very minimally, that has huge implications for thinking about aging and longevity that we never would have known or thought about if we hadn't really stepped outside of the normal kind of biomedical circuit to the kinds of populations that anthropologists, this is more their bread and butter. So I would say, as an anthropologist, what I had to contribute was one, kind of looking and studying where most people are not. But then also, I think taking, as an evolutionary anthropologist in particular, taking a broader perspective on the history of our species, right?
Yeah.
And so thinking about lifespan, longevity, and aging, not so much from a clinical perspective, right? But from an evolutionary perspective, where even just the basic idea, maximizing lifespan is not a goal of evolution, natural selection, right? That's something that we want for ourselves. But if we understand biology, then we can get a different perspective. So yeah, that was also, I would say, something that I had to contribute that many other folks involved in the aging lifespan arena are not.
And how is old age defined? Because I think that this question will be important for when later we talked about how we actually evolved to live around 70 years and why we have post-reproductive lifespan and all of that. So how do you define old age?
Yeah, so I talk about this a little bit in the book, right? Where certainly the people I work with, if they don't know their age and you don't have numbers beyond like 7, then maybe you don't age, right? You just, if you can't identify it, it doesn't happen. But, of course, obviously that sounds silly to even suggest, but it's not. The one aspect of it that might be true is it's hard to obsess over your age, like the number, if it's just not something that's salient in your life. Like no one like looms with dread when they're approaching their 40th birthday or their 50th birthday or their 60th, because they wouldn't really know that particular milestone is happening. And so I think, people around the world sort of defined old age, in a way that just seems a bit more practical, right? Something somewhat functional, when you can no longer do certain things that you're used to doing. You can't see quite as well as you used to. You have trouble moving around. These are the ways that people have defined kind of old age in terms of, I think, functionality. And and I think that sort of underlies a lot of the cultural dialogue now about you're only as old as you feel, that 40 is the new 30, 50 is the new 40, where if we're able to actually be in the kind of shape at 50 that maybe we would have been 100 years ago when we were 40, then yeah, in a way you have kind of delayed aging a bit, and we should think about it in those particular terms. So yeah, so I kind of take a more holistic kind of view about what is old age. Now, certainly when you're doing studies, it's hard to take that kind of holistic view. And for practical purposes, I still think it's instructive to say, all right, amongst people age 60 and over or age 65 and over, let's look at their health, or let's look at certain characteristics. And, whether or not even at age 65, some people are going to feel a lot younger, are going to be a lot healthier than other folks. And that's part of the thing that's just really interesting and exciting to try to understand. Why does the variability, it just increases with age, right? Everyone age 20 is probably in reasonably decent shape, regardless of how much they're exercising or not. let alone, let's leave the Olympic athletes out of that. But, by 65, there's just huge range of variability in people's health and condition.
Yeah, I guess that an interesting point to make here as well is that, I mean, of course, much more about this than I do, but there are at least some traditional societies where people don't count time the way we do, or, I mean, of course, they are aware of the passage of time, but they possibly don't even have the notion of a year. So I mean, they don't know they are, or they don't even care if they are 40 years old, 50 years old, 60 years old. And I mean, of course, the point I'm making here is not to say that because they don't have the same notions of time that we have, that they are uncivilized or something like that, because those are not really scientific terms. And but I mean, they have a different way of noticing the passage of time than we do, right?
Yeah, and I think, so aside from how you're feeling in your own health and condition, you can also think about just in terms of life stage. So, if you have children, then, maybe that puts you in a different category. And then certainly by the time your children have children and you're a grandparent, it's like, oh, now I feel old. But, again, that's relative, because in a lot of places, if you're having your first child at age 18, then, and your children have their first children at 18, then by the time you're still in your mid 30s, you're a grandparent. And by the time you're in your 50s, you're a great grandparent. So again, it's sort of relevant, but it's not, it can't cleanly be defined old age, specifically as that.
And so, what is life expectancy? Because we use this term a lot, but what actually is life expectancy, and what kinds of information can we get from it?
Yeah, good. So I think when people think about lifespan, it's probably the most common thing to come to mind, that we think about the life expectancy and life expectancy is of a population, right? Not really of a person, but we ascribe it to a person. So if the life expectancy in the US, for example, is like 78, then we do think that on average, a person born will live about 78 years. So the expectancy part means it's an average, right? And that's all it is. It's the average lifespan in a population, but it's a bit deceptive, right? Because imagine there's 100 people, and everyone born lives to age 50, and so the average there is the same as everyone's lifespan. And so the average life expectancy would be 50. And in that case, it represents everyone in the population. But you can also have a life expectancy of 50 where half the people live to 100 and half the people, die right after they're born. And so the average there is also going to be 50, because half the people live to 100 and half the people kind of died at birth. But in that particular case, no one lived to 50, right? They either died right after birth or they lived 100 years. So this is where life expectancy sometimes can be quite distant from the lived years of the majority of people in the population. And so, I introduced this in the book because we're so used to hearing that life expectancy in the past and life expectancy in groups like hunter-gatherers, was low. That it was in the 30s, sometimes even in the 20s, and on a good day, maybe in the 40s. But what that doesn't mean, it doesn't refer to that first example that everyone lived to their 30s and then they died. But it's more like the second example, that there's such a huge concentration of deaths early in life. That first year of life is the most dangerous. And then even to age 5, over a quarter of births of people born wouldn't make it to their 5th birthday. Sometimes that can be, even higher, like 30, 35%. So when you take that into account, then it actually turns out on the other side, there's lots of people making it into adulthood and well into adulthood. So if you're able to make it past that gauntlet, that first, say, 15 years of life, so you're kind of close to being an adult, then there's actually a good chance that you make it to your 40s, 50s, 60s, and even into your 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And so, hence that's, the title of the book. I'm glad you had a copy with you. I had to look for mine to find it. But this idea that we've lived to 7 decades in the past, and that's actually, if you do look into adulthood, the sort of average lifespan in adulthood for those who make it to adulthood is in that kind of 6 to 7 decades range. I have to always be careful now when I say that, because I did that. My son was like, "Did you say 6, 7 decades?" I don't know if it's in Portugal, but I was in Malaysia a couple months ago, and I heard people doing the 6, 7 thing. So it's global.
Oh. Yeah, I think so. I mean, do you think that we should also clarify when we talk about life expectancy, whether we're talking about life expectancy at birth or life expectancy after people reach a particular age?
Yeah, I think, and that's a good question to ask. I recently wrote an op-ed about this, because I do think sometimes when people think about like the tech bros and wanting to live as long as possible, they're not really talking about life expectancy. They're thinking more like maximum lifespan, or like amongst the people who can make it to age 70, how can we maximize the chance that we make it to age 100 or 110? Whereas I think if we're really interested in the greatest good for the greatest number, then life expectancy is a good measure, right? Because it does reflect, if a third of the population is not making it to their 5th birthday, then yeah, that's great for the people who are making it into 70s and 80s and 90s. But what about, all those lives that were cut tragically short? So if we really want to maximize the lived years in a population, then the lowest hanging fruit is actually all of those deaths in the first 7 decades, if not even the first 2 decades. And especially, it's not just in high income countries, but all over the world, we could do a lot better for improving survival within those first 7 decades. And that would improve life expectancy probably more, and definitely more per dollar spent, than trying to focus on making it from age 80 to age 110.
Right. Tell us also about dependency ratio. I mean, what is that and why is it important?
Trying to remember the context in which I talked about it. Probably when we think about, so we've talked about aging of individual bodies, but when we think about population aging, then it's this idea, well, as the population is getting older and older, and so currently, for example, in the United States, like 1 in 6 people is over age 65, and we're frantic because, just within a couple decades, that's gonna be like 1 in 5, if not even leaning towards 1 in 4. And so as the shape of the population pyramid, where the bottom is like the youngest and then the oldest is at the top, for the longest time, it kind of looked like this. And then over time, as we get older and older, and we have fewer and fewer kids, the pyramid starts to look like this. And so it actually highlights 2 things. One, the fact that we're getting older, living longer, meaning there's more old people in the population. But it's important that we're having fewer kids, because if it was just that we're living longer, the population could still stay like this if we're still, having lots of kids. But when both those things are going on at once, the population pyramid starts to, look very cylindrical, and sometimes even the reverse. becomes top heavy. We have more, I forget the year, but pretty soon we're approaching where we're going to have more people over age 65 than we might have, under age 5, for example. And so what that means then in terms of dependency ratio is that it's usually defined as something like how many dependents are there in a population, individuals that need or require care. And typically you would think, well, those are children, but it could also be, older adults. Now this is where it starts to matter. If you just use age 65 plus, but we're actually healthier than we used to be, then maybe those people age 65 to 75, are they really dependent or are they not? So, I talk about this a little bit in the book that it's not the best way of kind of measuring it, but it's the way it's often done. And so if the dependency ratio is high, then that just suggests, okay, we have more and more people to take care of. And so there's the individuals that need care, and then the individuals who are giving the care, the caregivers, the producers. So we think about GDP and productivity. And so it's, how do you make a society run given that we all come in all flavors of age and sex? And so with the basic idea that if too many of us are in the dependent category, are things sustainable? Who's going to do all the caregiving? As it is, if you have few people who are of, working ages, if those folks have to take time off work to be caregivers, then that's reducing the effective number of people out there in the workforce even more. So this is where dependency ratio becomes this sort of critical turning point for thinking about like these societal issues about aging.
In the book, you also use this term health span. What does that mean?
Yeah. So, in some ways, health span is just the sexier way of thinking about lifespan. That, lifespan is just literally referring to the number of years. Whereas, even now, I think it's hard to find someone that is just so committed to extending that number without regard to the quality of those years, right? And so the idea of health span would be like sort of your lifespan of healthy years. So in the best possible world, your health span equals your lifespan. In other words, you're healthy all your life, and then as soon as things turn bad, you die, right? Whereas in the other extreme, health span is relatively short compared to lifespan. So it might be great that you're living a long life, but if you're spending a good number of those years sort of unhealthy, then one, you yourself might not be very happy. You might be suffering, but also the toll it might take on the healthcare system, the need for caregivers, and all the things that go along with that. So yeah, this is why people talk about, they're not maximizing lifespan. They want to maximize health span and reduce that lifespan health span gap.
In traditional societies, is health span long? How much time do people spend in older age dependent? How much time do they depend on others before they die?
It's a great question, and it's actually never really been addressed. And I've been playing around with my next grant that I'd like to write. Just moving beyond years and thinking about different ways of thinking about the quality of those years, physical health being one aspect of it, but mental health certainly another. And what does that look like at all ages, so that you can apply some of the common metrics that are used to calculate health span, like in high income countries? Can we also do that in some of these traditional populations? And it's never been done. I think people's guess about things is that the gap between health span and lifespan is relatively short. What I kind of suspect, though, is that it's not that, we tend to think of it like the gap between health span and lifespan is at the end of that health span. So that, wow, you live the first 65 years really healthy, But then if lifespan is like 75, then from 65 to 75, those are the unhealthy years. But I think in a lot of traditional societies, those unhealthy years are really distributed across the life course, right? That certainly when infection is a major source of morbidity and mortality, that's occurring at all ages. So it's not all concentrated to the end of life. But in general, the idea that the number of years spent with like elder care, would be relatively short in traditional societies. And, that was one of the first questions about, when we discovered that there wasn't much heart disease, the sort of internal skeptic was like, well, maybe there is heart disease, but people just don't live long with it, right? Again, that like life gets cut short when morbidity presents itself. And so yeah, that we need to study more to understand really what does health span look like over that life course. And certainly as lifespan starts extending, right? Because even in a lot of traditional populations, things are changing in ways that there's positive and negative. The positive is that lifespans are longer, but what is that actually doing to health span? Is health span moving in concert with lifespan, or is it moving more slowly? And if it's moving more slowly, that means we're adding more unhealthy years than we are adding healthy years.
What can we learn from studying longevity record breakers like supercentenarians? And I mean, I know that, of course, supercentenarians, people who live beyond 100 years, I mean, it's a very small number of people. And I also know that perhaps there are some variables there that are very hard to control, like their habits. And I also know that some of them appear to be just lucky in terms of their genetics, because there have been cases of people who were supercentenarians and smoked and have not really healthy diets and things like that. So what can we learn from studying them, if anything?
Yeah. So the pessimistic skeptic answer is nothing. Right? Because I think you captured some elements there. It's a very small subset of the population, and it's folks who, lifespan, certainly has genetic underpinnings for the most part. And as you get to those older ages, the genetic underpinnings are much stronger. So, making it beyond 100, you have a healthy set of genes that, are affecting from DNA repair to, nutrient sensing in your cells to, cancer surveillance, that you manage to evade all the major killers. And, I do think it's instructive and interesting because they are exceptions, right? Just like, super exceptional athletes, certainly exceptional athletes have put in their 10,000 hours, but an excellent soccer goalie is not going to be 5'4", right? And so Prince was an amazing musician, but was never going to be an amazing basketball player. That's why the Dave Chappelle skit of Prince playing basketball is a classic. So yeah, I think they're entertaining stories, but you're right. There are a couple studies. One was a study with Ashkenazi Jews who lived beyond age 95, and comparing them to Americans that didn't make it that late. And there's not any difference really in their cigarette smoking, their alcohol consumption, their diet, their physical activity. So they're not really doing a whole lot different, but they're reacting very differently to their environments, but there is another study that did show, the chance of making it to as a centenarian, you probably did have, sustained healthier habits. But again, when I say we can still learn something from that, but it's not something that we don't kind of already know from many other epidemiological studies, that there's just, a handful of habits prevention. That if you are not a major consumer of alcohol, you have a relatively healthy diet, you're moving your body in a physically active way, so the volume of physical
if you don't
activity.
smoke.
Yeah, you don't smoke. Stay away from heavy opioids. Try to manage stress. Just those like 6 things alone will basically really increase your chances of making it to age 70, if not 80, 90, or 100. And so we kind of know that without even going to the people living beyond 100.
Yeah.
Certainly, I think it's just really amazing to talk to those people, just because think about the lives that they've lived, the experiences over such a long haul of history, the things that they've seen. I do think they're like our super elders. And so the same way that there's a lot to learn from older people, I think there's a lot we can learn from them, but not necessarily, which I think is what you're asking, can we learn how to live to 100 from talking to those people? Probably absolutely not.
Yeah, I mean, because if you listen to some of them, that French lady who still holds the record for the longest lifespan, I mean, it was 122 years and I don't know how many days, but I mean, if you follow her advice, the only thing she mentioned was that she ate chocolate every day. She used a lot of olive oil, and she never married. So,
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
I'm not sure if those are the 3 secrets to reach
Right.
120 years of age.
I mean, it's the same thing, you want to be, you look to, people in Hollywood or celebrities to, what to wear, as if like that's going to make us, turn us into celebrities. And, you can pick and choose the habits that you like. I mean, Jean Calment had a great sense of humor, right? I remember my favorite quote from her, I only have one wrinkle and I'm sitting on it. So certainly, that probably helped her get through things. Doesn't mean it's going to work for the rest of us. Comedians are hilarious. But I would guess that the average comedian lifespan is significantly lower than the average lifespan in the population. But
Yeah,
anyway.
it's probably also not a good idea to try to be a comedian out of a comedy context, because yeah, I mean, you might get punched in the face nowadays.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so you've already partly answered this question before, but what can we learn from approaching aging and lifespan from an evolutionary perspective?
Yeah. I think that's a great question, and that there's so many elements to it, right? From just like the simple idea that, while our body is sort of a well put together machine, that it's not a machine, right? It's not designed, with blueprints from the outset. And so, the way it's sort of built upon, past forms, means there's lots of imperfections, and there's lots of design features that, wouldn't be ideal if our goal was to make it, as long as possible in a healthy way. Just for example, lower back pain, not only is that one of the most common forms of morbidity around the world, in the small scale societies I've worked in, it's also one of the number one complaints, lower back pain. And so, an evolutionary perspective, sort of aligns the fact that, yeah, we'd like to live a long, healthy life, but that's a means to an end, right? And if the end is sort of, reproductive success, then once we start thinking about, what are the impacts of different body systems on those combined goals of survival and reproductive success, it changes a little bit how we think about design and how we think about health. So the other aspect too, like successful aging or healthy aging, are these popular concepts out there that, I think are great for, clinical approach. Like, we want to live long and we want that to be healthy years. But again, we can't just look to hunter gatherers and say, well, what they did must get us there because, evolution and all that stuff. Like, no, there's so much misguided ideas about, paleo this and paleo that, that, the very fact that, okay, groups like the Chimane don't have heart disease, don't have Alzheimer's, but they also, rarely live into their 90s and beyond, right? And they're more likely to die at every age of life compared to your average European or American. And so, yeah, they're not getting heart disease, but they're more likely to suffer from a common cold or pneumonia than we are. And so, an evolutionary approach, I think, helps us think about all the trade-offs involved and helps us think about sort of the force of selection. So it's kind of zooming out, the classic evolutionary approach just takes, are you producing babies, right? And the force of selection, once you start reproducing, the force of selection is declining to the point where if you're no longer producing babies, then the force of selection, kind of goes to zero. And so that means any gene that has harmful effects on your health, but those harmful effects, only express in what's called the selection shadow, like after menopause, then those genes over evolutionary time can accumulate. And so you can get something like aging, and that could be favored by natural selection because genes that basically have those effects, a good number of them probably also have beneficial effects on surviving earlier in life and on fertility older in life. And because surviving without fertility is an evolutionary dead end, evolution's always going to favor genes that basically lead to some fitness enhancing effect throughout life, even if it comes at the cost of making you more likely to die in the selection shadow. So just even that basic elements, I think, have been really instructive for thinking about aging and lifespan across the tree of life. Certainly evolutionary approach is, if you just think about humans, that's kind of limited. But just to know out there, each species is like a different natural experiment, and that, Greenland sharks can live several hundred years. That's amazing, right? There's, other species that, effectively can live thousands of years, like certain trees. And so certainly, there might be lessons to be learned, to date. Just you can't just take simple tree genes and then plant them in humans and have us live a long life, but I think we're getting more insight into the forces that shape a typical lifespan and that shape the likelihood of being around for a long life. So we have a species typical lifespan, and that's kind of where 7 decades speaks a little bit closer to what would have been more typical lifespan. So a potential lifespan, not an average life lived or anything like that, but how long you could live under reasonably good conditions over most of our evolutionary history. And the one thing I'll say then before I shut up, the good news there, right? Because your listeners who are in their 70s or 80s are like, what the hell am I? Is that I think we've done better, and that typical lifespan now, in 2025 is definitely closer to 8 or 9 decades. And so, making it well into adulthood, yeah, there's a really good chance that you can make it into your 80s and even into your 90s.
You mentioned...
but not 150 is what I was going to say. That we still, it's a variation on the theme, but you're not doubling our lifespan.
Right. No, I was just going to say, before I ask you about another topic, that at a certain point you mentioned paleo approaches to health there. And I mean, those kinds of things, I have to say, really irritate me, because whenever I talk with anthropologists, what I learn is that they never what people say about that never makes sense when it comes to diet, for example. I mean, I've talked with several anthropologists on the show who study diet across different traditional societies, and basically the conclusion is that people eat whatever they have available. So in their environment. So I mean, and if you are to look across all traditional societies, I mean, you don't have one single diet that everyone eats, right? I mean, so it doesn't make sense to talk about a paleo diet.
Yeah, that's exactly right. But even if there was a single kind of diet, just because hunter-gatherers were eating that diet, again, hunter-gatherers, though, weren't living as long as we would hope to live. And
Yeah.
so it might still be the case that there's foods out there or combinations of nutrients that, if our goal was only to live longer, could do better, right? And that's not
Yeah.
even the case, right? Because yes, hunter-gatherer diets are fairly diverse, and yeah, people ate, locally because that's all there was. Yeah, so right, it's quite ridiculous. Now, there are some commonalities, though. Certainly, processed foods with lots of kind of crazy unknown ingredients,
Mhm.
that doesn't exist in any hunter-gatherer diet. But it also doesn't exist in most diets of just any kind of traditional subsistence populations, herders, farmers,
Mhm.
and even our own population, a couple hundred years ago. So that would be kind of something right, but that's not usually when people think about paleo, they're thinking about how
Yeah.
much meat, what kinds of meat, should I go full keto and eliminate carbs? I shouldn't eat this, or seed oils and the obsessive or all these things. And that part is a bit ridiculous. Yeah.
Yeah, also because many of those people who propose paleo diets exclude, even for populations who have had a past of being agricultural societies, they exclude things like cereals and vegetables and milk. And I mean, at this point, we know that at least societies who have evolved with agriculture that had milk available and cereals and vegetables and all of that. I mean, we have evolved adaptations, gastrointestinal adaptations to process those types of foods as well. Right.
That's right. Yeah. In fact, the pace of genetic evolution, accelerated with the growth of populations in the last, 10, 12,000 years. And a lot of those, local adaptations are, related to diet, pathogens and diet, right? The two things that vary a lot locally. And
Yeah.
so, even if there was a single diet that was the best, the healthiest, like say a Mediterranean diet, doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be the healthiest for every possible body around the globe.
Yes.
Certainly, it might be better than one just filled with ultra processed foods and sugary sodas and things like that. But yeah, I still think there's kind of a lot to learn, and I would say the biggest thing with diets is just we generally eat too much. Right. So regardless of the food, it's just
Yeah.
the sheer quantity of calories that we consume, more than anything else is probably more responsible for our obesity epidemic than, the relative contributions of carbs and protein and fats.
So let me ask you, because when it comes to aging, there are those people who say that we should, or argue that we should approach aging as a disease itself, because they then start talking about how aging is associated with all kinds of damage to the body, from genetic damage to cellular damage to extracellular damage to other kinds of damage that is cumulative, and then that's what's also associated with chronic diseases of different kinds. But I mean, do you think that we should approach aging itself as a disease?
Yeah. Also, you got good questions. Um,
I mean, I interviewed Aubrey de Grey a few months ago, so that's why that came to my mind.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, certainly we're used to fighting diseases, right? And so I think, if you want to fight something, you call it a disease, is kind of one approach, I think. There's also a legal aspect, at least in the United States, where if you want to sell drugs, then it has to be, in order to get FDA approval, it has to be because it's helping prevent or treat a disease. And so otherwise, then it just becomes like a supplement and then kind of gets grouped with all the new agey stuff that, maybe people won't take as seriously. And so there's that practical aspect to it. The thing that then gets wonky in thinking about a disease is none of us are escaping aging, right? That means we're all going to get the disease, right? So is it really a disease if it's something that everyone gets? I mean, in the past, pregnancy was labeled a disease. Masturbation is a disease. I mean, all these things that is it a disease? Okay. So so I don't think that it's super helpful to think of aging as a disease, other than sort of as a rallying cry. Certainly the whole kind of field of geroscience is, oriented around, well, rather than dealing with sort of these symptoms of the larger issue, like, okay, if you whack, like playing whack-a-mole, right? You can treat some of the heart disease, you can treat some of the diabetes, but then something else is going to rear its ugly head if you survive those things. And so this idea that let's deal with the real disease, let's deal with aging, and if you could slow aging, then it probably is the case that all the other diseases of aging would probably, become less common or delayed as well. So I do think, but I think we need to not put all of our eggs in one basket or the other. That it's still the case that many of us do get these diseases, and for those people, we do want to treat colon cancer, right? Especially as that's something that's appearing younger and younger right now in a lot of countries. So that's real. We don't want to wait for the miracle of slowing aging generally and hoping it's going to affect those things. So I do think we need to still kind of keep the one disease at a time approach, while there's other work going on that's also funding for thinking about aging processes, the hallmarks of aging that in the hierarchy of things are connected to those downstream diseases, but are somewhat distinct from it. But because aging is something that affects like the entire body, it's so much more difficult to think about and treat. I mean, we have a hard enough time even just thinking about like cancer, right? We actually understand cancer, what it is, and what's going on in the body, but that knowledge doesn't allow you to treat it effectively, right? In fact, most of the advances with cancer are really about early detection, right? So like Pap smears for cervical cancer has done more to reduce cervical cancer than any kind of treatment of cervical cancer per se. And then of course, like HPV vaccines, again, further prevention, that's gone a long way. But just the fact that, your cells go rogue and we know these mutations occur and there's a whole set of cascading processes, but that doesn't allow us the ability to actually act on that and make a change in our underlying biology in ways that eliminate cancer. So if we can't do that with one disease, how can we do that with aging that affects all of our cells in our body? And, just quite practically, the successes that we've seen in Drosophila and even in rodents, just so far don't really apply to humans.
So these 70 years of lifespan, these 70 years on average that we live, if of course we exclude the a high child mortality rate, at least in more traditional societies. How have we evolved to live around 70 years? I mean, why is it that we don't have a shorter lifespan or a longer lifespan?
Oh yeah, another good question. Why not 80? Why not 40?
Why not 100?
Yeah, why not 100? And so there definitely, one hypothesis, right, is that the niche that humans inhabit. So the easiest comparison we can make sometimes is to chimpanzees. So chimpanzees are sort of our best guess of what our common ancestor would have been like, in different aspects of their ecology, but also in terms of their life history. And so, in chimpanzees, their life expectancy is a lot lower, but their adult life expectancy is a lot lower in particular. In fact, early in life, there's a bit of overlap. But, no chimpanzee is living really well into 7 decades in the wild or under captivity. Very, very, very few. And so, what one hypothesis is that, when we kind of shifted our lifestyle towards a more hunting and gathering dependent one, that this was something that kind of extended development because it wasn't very easy. You weren't just picking fruits off a tree that were ripe. This was like learning a whole set of skills, and it's not just like hunting, but even like gathering roots. You can't even see them. They're underground. So you need to know where to look, what rocks to turn over, how to dig. And so, that kind of learning, we find in studies that kind of measure at what ages are people able to be effective hunter-gatherers on their own, that takes up to about almost 2 decades, kind of like the equivalent of graduating hunter-gatherer high school before people can start making a living relatively on their own. And certainly, but by that point, they've been so heavily subsidized by others that they haven't really paid it forward yet. And so this idea that, okay, so we shifted a lifestyle of hunting and gathering where you basically created, going back again to dependence, right? The first, almost 2 decades of dependency would only really make sense if you had a lengthy period in adulthood where you were sort of net positive, where you're basically reaping in these surpluses. And so that's what we see in hunting and gathering societies, that adults can be really, bringing in these bonanzas of food. And you see that peak of production, just calories brought in per day, well into the 30s, if not even sometimes into the 40s, especially once you add some farming. Groups like the Chimane, that peak is more in the 40s than in the 30s. So that alone, sort of like the whole life course, like in order to kind of balance your accounting sheets, that we would have delayed aging and reduced mortality in ways that a hunting and gathering lifestyle became more viable. In fact, the hunting and gathering lifestyle was only really viable because we were able to increase survival well into adulthood. And so now you have multi-generational provisioning and cooperation. And that's why I argue in the book that in many ways, our longevity is not sort of a consequence of our success as a species, but it's one of the reasons that we've been a successful species, because of that ability to kind of learn, the necessary skills in your environment, and then to become really effective producer in your environment, and then to be kind of involved in multi-generational cooperation in ways that not one, not two, even three generations actively cooperating with divisions of labor allowed us to really succeed. So now I can't even remember what the original question was. Was it about?
I mean, it was about basically how we evolved to
7 decades. Yeah.
yeah.
And so 7 decades, when you look at that production that I was mentioning, it doesn't last forever, right? So you become good, but as your physical prowess starts to decline, and even some of our cognitive maintenance is compromised, you start to see this sort of coordination in the life course, that at the time when production is starting to decline, the type of transfers that individuals are making, so the flow of resources and services, is also starting to decline. And it's at a time when survival is starting to decline, our health is becoming more compromised, and all of that seems to be occurring around 7 decades. So that was sort of the coordination there. Now you could argue, well, all right, that makes sense as a coordinated system, but why is that coordinated system happening at 7 decades and not at 80? Why aren't there 70-year-old hunters that are really effective and still producing? And that's a kind of a more difficult question, right? Because then it really, why isn't our VO2 max preserved to peak at age 45 instead of age 25? There's so many kind of coordinated systems. And what I do in the book is try to outline a framework for thinking about these things. Like, what would be the marginal benefit on fitness if you could shift VO2 max a little bit so that now it peaks at age 30 instead of age 25? Maybe it is a benefit, but at what cost does it come? And is that the best allocation of limited resources in our body to make it all happen? And so even though we might want that peak to be 8 decades instead of 7, it just doesn't seem to be that's what was worked out evolutionarily over time in our particular species. So I will say that there was a little bit of there was no back of the envelope calculation saying, look, 7 decades. It was starting off actually looking at lifespans in hunter-gatherer populations that are around today, but also even into the past, and looking and saying, it seems to be the case that there's this big kind of mountain of lifespans in adulthood, with the peak of that mountain at around 7 decades. How can we understand that in relation to everything we know about the human body? So a little bit working backwards. So, but it does seem that there's a lot of coordination. And even though we've done really well with ourselves now, as I mentioned, 9 decades, 8 or 9 decades, it's still the case, though, in that period of 6, 7 decades where, heart disease, cancers, they're all increasing rapidly. So even although our ability to kind of withstand those assaults is improved now compared to the past, there's still some inevitabilities that are kind of built into our biology that haven't gone away. Those things aren't being well delayed too much into the future.
So in more traditional societies, we've already talked about infant mortality, but how are lives cut short? I mean, apart from infant mortality, and particularly in the case of adults, what do they die from usually?
Yeah, good question. And so pretty much almost everything except for the major killers that we tend to see, like in the industrialized world, right? So not the heart disease, and not just because people aren't living long enough to see that. I mean, some of the studies we did on heart disease is focused on people in the age ranges that would have gotten heart disease in our populations. So just like accidents, for example, are fairly common. So even in the absence of cars, there's certainly lots of accidental deaths, drownings, falls, fatal falls. You wield a machete every day, and sometimes you you cut right into your foot, and then your foot gets infected, and then we can die of secondary infections. Certainly kind of warfare related deaths, especially on men, were more common in the past than they are now. And then for women, that kind of gets balanced out in women with deaths related to childbirth. So maternal mortality rates are way higher in subsistence-oriented populations in the absence of healthcare. Partly they have so many more children, right? So the average Chimane woman over her reproductive life has 9 births. So that's 9 chances, right, where there's the possibility of, potentially dying from childbirth-related illness.
But there's a low probability that all 9 of those children will reach adulthood, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, if all 9 kids made it to adulthood, we would all be Chimane by now, right? The growth rate would be astronomical. Now, it is the case, though, the growth rate of a lot of indigenous groups living traditional lives is quite high. So the Chimane, it's over 3.5% growth rate, which is like a doubling time, under 20 years. When I first started working with the Chimane, estimates were like 8,000 Chimane, and now the estimates are closer to 18,000. So certainly the growth rate of the population is higher now than it would have been in the past. So even, when groups like the Chimane live a much more traditional lifestyle compared to how we live, but their lives have changed a lot, right? I mean, 3% growth would not have been sustainable, let alone the fact that, there'd be many more Chimane around today than there are if that kind of growth rate was going on for a long, long period of time. So yeah, those are the kinds of things, but largely, what we find is that about half the deaths at almost all ages are due to one type of infection or another. And this, we kind of know, right? In the big epidemiological transition that hit high income countries, that we made that shift. We cleaned up the water supply, we cleaned up trash off the street, we didn't have open sewers. And then after that, antibiotics and medicine, we really were able to largely eliminate lots of infection. Vaccines, back when we actually thought those were good things, eliminated so many infections, so much so that we kind of forgot how harmful and deadly those infections are until now. Of course, they're starting to come back. Even where I am in California, we're seeing more measles and whooping cough cases than we've ever seen before. But yeah, largely eliminating lots of infections was, a huge boost to life expectancy and years lived in around the world. And that doesn't exist in a lot of small scale traditional populations.
When it comes to maternal mortality rate, I mean, that affects women a lot in traditional societies, does it have to do primarily with the fact that, I mean, our our brains, our craniums, it became very large in our evolutionary history, and the birth canals didn't catch up fast enough. I mean, does it have anything to do with that or not?
I mean, it could. It's. I mean, there's. From disrupted placentas to high gestational diabetes. There's a lot of different reasons why women sometimes die in and around childbirth or months after childbirth. Some of those could be related to the big head that they're squeezing through their body. But even now, right, that where there's so many mothers that have C-sections, in many ways that sort of prevented what might have been fatal in childbirth for baby and or mother. But now that also requires additional preventive measures, right? Because you've just done major surgery, and so that's
Yeah.
ripe for infection, and
Mhm.
and there is a small percentage, right, of women that suffer from sepsis after a C-section surgery, and so yeah, I think it probably contributes to that, but it's not really the sole reason for that.
Okay.
An infection is still kind of a big kind of relevant part there for maternal mortality.
And so, why is it that we live past our reproductive years? I mean, because it could just be the case that once we can no longer reproduce, we would just die. So, why is it that we have post reproductive
Yeah.
lifespan?
Yeah. Well, for most species, that is the case, right?
Mm.
That the aging of your muscular skeletal system, tracks along with the aging of your reproductive system. And that's kind of what makes most sense from kind of a natural selection perspective, that as your ability to put genes in the next generation starts declining, then everything in your body starts declining. And yeah, humans are kind of one of those rare species that where those seem to be separate. We're not the only species that
Mhm.
where that occurs, but certainly one of the fewest. And and there's two things that could be going on. One, there's you could have long life, but just extend the age of menopause, right? Like so they can still
Mhm.
track. Or if menopause is sort of constrained, then your only thing you can move is lifespan. And so you get this post-reproductive lifespan. And
Yeah.
so it does seem to be that, menopause is a bit and reproductive senescence is more constrained than our ability to just live. And so you see that bigger gap.
Yeah.
And that's another reason why the 7 decades is kind of an important discovery, because, one idea was just that, well, we only live well beyond 50, let's say 50 as the age of menopause. We only live well beyond 50 more recent human history. And so it's not really an evolutionary puzzle why there's post-reproductive lifespan if
Mm.
post-50 lifespan is recent. But no, the idea is that even in hunter-gatherers, even in our past, women would have spent, if they made it into adulthood, a good chunk of their adult life in a post-reproductive state. That this is something that has existed long enough, and it's costly to achieve, that natural selection should have something to say about this. And that's where, I guess I would say, the biggest contender for thinking about the why of all of that is that it must be the case that the force of selection is not zero. So you're not
Mhm.
directly putting genes in the next generation by having babies, but
Right.
you must be indirectly doing it by improving your fitness in other ways, right? Helping your children survive, helping your children find mates, helping your children with their own children, so your
Mhm.
grandchildren. And so all the different things that adults do that could be impacting the fitness of their relatives and of themselves, but in ways that just don't involve directly having babies themselves. And so that's sort of the big kind of contender for thinking about post-reproductive lifespan. Um, and why, the 7 decades, this kind of gets us back to your earlier question, that grandmas are great, right? But a grandmother at age 60 might not be contributing to fitness in the same way as a grandmother at age 85, right?
Right.
And so there's a point at which those benefits of having grandmother alive become a bit saturated relative to the cost of keeping her alive.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
so, that in that balancing act, that's where I think 7 decades sort of comes out uh, a bit. That, well beyond 7 decades, frailty settles in, and even the ability to indirectly reproduce through all the different things that older adults do, like helping kin when they're fighting and not getting along, helping kids, instructing them in all the ways of the local culture,
Mhm.
uh, those benefits, become small or even impossible to confer relative to just the fact that you're a physical body that still needs to eat every day. And if you're mobile, that's even worse because you need to be physically moved as the group is moving, and that those costs become, heavy relative to the benefits. And somewhere in that ballpark, I think 7 decades comes out.
Yeah, I mean, there's the grandmother hypothesis, but what about men? I mean, why is it that we also have grandfathers? Because it could just be the case that grandmothers would do the bulk of the work and who we wouldn't even need grandfathers. So,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. Well, and that's where, the I mean, we're mammals and we share a lot of our biology. The developmental plan works out in certain ways. Men have nipples, right? Even though we're not breastfeeding. And so, one idea is that, let's just say that all the fitness benefits accrue to one sex, but then the other sex gets dragged along, right? So, one view of the world, it's all about grandmothers. Grandfathers are irrelevant. Granted, if they're surviving longer because of shared biology with grandmothers, then maybe, hey, they're going to kick in and help out a little bit too. Another idea is, well, the benefits really are accruing to men because they don't have menopause, so they could continue reproducing into well past age 50. It actually turns out that, yeah, on average, men tend to be a few years older than the women that they're married to. So if men's wives' fertility is declining, their fertility is declining too, just offset by a few years. And so even though men don't have physical menopause, though, they kind of have an effective menopause, just delayed a little bit. But there's been some modeling done showing that, the excess fertility benefits men might get might be enough to offset that declining force of selection. And in that case, women will be dragged along. But I think, I just kind of like there's no single paleo diet. I feel like there's no single ecology where it's all women or it's all men. It's one of those things where to varying degrees and in different currencies, men and women are going to be contributing to their fitness. And yeah, in different places, it might vary a little bit. And maybe like in more gerontocratic herding societies where men have multiple wives, maybe they are. Some few men are reproducing well into their 70s. But even in those cases, the majority of men are not. But on average, there could be a net effect, but then those men might not be doing a lot of caregiving, but then the older women might be doing a lot more caregiving. We just haven't really done the studies. The very few studies that have been done have been mostly like food provisioning, because food is easy it comes in every day when people come back from hunting and gathering or from their fields, and so it's easy to measure things. But older adults are making contributions in so many different ways. And so just the same way where we used to think like, oh, where men were bringing in the bacon all the time, but we were discounting all the ways that women were contributing to production. And once you consider all those ways, then it boosts women's productivity relative to men's. And I think it's a similar kind of thing that men and women are both making fitness contributions. I don't think they have to be equal just because, the moral dictates of gender equality say it has to be that way. But I do. So I think it will vary across populations and contexts. But I don't think we should necessarily be thinking it's all just grandmothers or all just grandfathers. And that's an important point because the grandmothering hypothesis, I think it was very influential and helpful. But there's so many studies that have only looked at the effects of grandmothers. And so we can't even know in those societies what grandfathers were even doing because it was assumed they're irrelevant. So they weren't even studied. And so, I guess my more gender neutral approach is that we just need to see what older adults are doing and all those manifold ways that they're indirectly contributing to their fitness if we really want to understand something about kind of aging and that balance between those fitness benefits of being alive at later ages and the costs of being alive.
Yeah, and I mean, when it comes to fathers and grandfathers, of course, I don't want to make too broad a statement here that might be incorrect, but at least in human societies, we have some degree of paternal and, I guess, grandpaternal investment, right? Of course, I'm sure it varies depending on the ecology, to what extent men, the fathers also invest in their offspring and so on, but there's always at least some degree of paternal investment, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And and certainly, you probably have talked to other people. Well, if you've had 1,200 interviews, I'm sure someone was talking about paternity certainty,
Yeah.
and how that kind of plays into, paternal investment. And again, that's just another part of the ecology that, if paternity certainty is lower, then maybe men are making fewer investments and investing more in mating effort. But on the whole, you do see plenty of male investment in children and grandchildren around the world.
Mhm. So, okay, this is going to be a darker question, I guess. But when older people, become too much of a burden in traditional societies, how are they dealt with? Because at a certain point in the book, you also talk about, for example, geronticide. So, I mean, what happens there?
Yeah. Yeah. I was at a mini workshop a few months ago on caregiving, and most people were there talking about caregiving of infants and children.
Yeah.
And then I gave a talk about elder care, and then geronticide as a form of caregiving. So, which probably was not what the organizers were expecting. But there's a little bit of truth to this idea, right? So, certainly throughout our history, there's a range of behaviors that, for lack of a better term, have been called death hastening behaviors, where based, on the extreme end could be like murder, right? You kill an old person. And on a more mild end, it could be like mild neglect, right? Maybe when, it's dinner time, they get the last plate, and they eat if there's a lot, but if there's not a lot, maybe they eat a little bit less. And so, and you can imagine that when circumstances are harsher, so in more nomadic hunting and gathering groups where you have to move camp every couple days, it's all else equal, a lot more difficult to care for someone who's in a frail state. And
Yeah.
so, almost always these cases of death hastening, are applied to what's called like the old, or like the, very frail elders. And it seems to be more common under those harsher conditions. As soon as you have farming and now you have somewhat semi-permanent settlements and you're not moving camp every other day, all of a sudden it becomes a lot easier. So even if you go out to your field for the day, you could leave grandma at the house, and
Yeah.
there's a good chance she'll still be there. You can leave a pot of food even for her. And assuming they're not being raided by anyone, that she would be okay. So it makes a big difference, those kinds of things. But I think in many ways, geronticide sounds kind of exotic and harsh and terrible, but we're faced with the same kinds of decisions now about
Yeah.
euthanasia and people willfully wanting to end their lives, and there's certain legal ramifications, like, is it a terminal illness? And it's a weird thing too, where certain stipulations that should be terminal. You also can't be depressed, because like that's which is odd. If you have a terminal illness, that might depress you, but if you're so depressed that you can't make a rational judgment, then that goes into play. But it's a similar kind of idea, these trade-offs, right? It's not someone like cruelly murdering an old person because they get joy out of it. It's
Yeah.
in some ways it's ending potential suffering, because that older person just might be miserable. That older person might also recognize that they feel like they're a burden, that they can't make the same contributions they were making before, and that doesn't make them happy. No one wants to feel like they're a drain on their kin, and especially in the context, in high fertility societies, you can quite literally see that calories that are going to feed you are calories that are being taken away for growing children, in a context again where a lot of children don't make it throughout childhood, and so every calorie helps. So in those contexts, the cases where there was sort of like outright geronticide, these were sort of like joint decisions that were made, by an elder and a close family member. And oftentimes it's the close family member that, deals the final blow. And so, yeah, it's not what people think when they think about geronticide.
Right.
What was that movie? Like, once you turn a certain age, you're pushed off a cliff. Because that's not how it is, right? There's no magic age. It's really about going, your first question, what's old age, right? When you're really frail and can no longer, especially what I see in Bolivia, when it comes to the point where you can't go to the bathroom yourself, you can't dress yourself, you have a hard time walking and getting around, and there's not maybe available caretakers. This is when you really see kind of neglect and sort of an accelerated death. Still not really outright geronticide, but sometimes people even try to end their own lives when circumstances become that bad.
Yeah. No, I also read a while ago that, for example, among the Inuit, the elder people, I mean, some of them at least, at a certain point when they notice that they can no longer follow the group, they just stay behind and let themselves die in the cold or something like that. So they make the decision themselves.
Yeah, I think that's true. That it's sort of an active. They're active contributors to that decision. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's been some exceptions to that, but it's always, I think, been in the context of these sort of harsh but practical kind of trade-offs, where it's really hard to care for everyone at the same time. I mean, sometimes the kind of caretaking needs come in direct conflict with trying to make a living, right? Especially when making a living means leaving home and going out and about for foraging. So, yeah, that's exactly right.
So, when it comes to the sort of age related changes that we tend to see in modern industrialized and post industrial societies, like changes in muscular strength and endurance, changes in the immune system, cognitive functions like decision making, memory, and so on. Is that something that we also tend to see in traditional societies? Are those same types of changes occurring there?
Yes, yeah, they are. The ages, might vary a little bit, but the shape of the relationships tend to look fairly similar. So even though, groups like the Chimane and the Hadza are so physically active every day, that doesn't mean that their VO2 max or their muscular strength is staying high and well preserved all throughout life. You're seeing sarcopenia or muscle wasting in those populations, just like you see in our population, and different aspects of heart health even. So even though like Chimane have healthy hearts, we've looked at their like ejection fraction and other components of like VO2 max, and you see declines in efficiency with age. Now they're still sort of in a fairly healthy range, but you're still seeing that decline with age. And so yeah, there's no real kind of getting around all of those things. Osteoporosis, and so weakening of loss of bone mineral, all of that we see in traditional populations. So yeah, those aspects are all the same, and the same thing with the brain, that relative to other, like whereas your heart VO2 max might peak in your 20s, early 30s, certain cognitive functions show kind of peaks in young adulthood and then decline thereafter, like different things related to like your executive function. But other aspects that reflect your cumulative knowledge show increases throughout the life course. And that one possibility, I hypothesize in the book, is because we inhabit such a brain-based ecology, right, where there's so much knowledge and decision making involved with hunting and gathering lifestyle, that it really prioritizes, it puts the premium on brain-based capital, right? That quite literally our babies and children are like have fat heads and tiny little bodies, and all of development is making that the body is getting bigger relative to the head, and then it's like filling the head. But everything's been designed towards like prioritizing the brain and its development, and so when we inhabit like such a skills intensive kind of feeding ecology, there's a premium to sort of keep that brain online and to keep it reasonably intact for as long as possible, so that even when our body, this is like getting into that framework of like, okay, if we lost 10% of muscle mass relative to say 10% of brain mass and cognitive function, which one would have a bigger impact on survival? Which one would have a bigger impact maybe on food production or something like that? And because the importance of our cognition is so great, I suspect that we could sacrifice some of our physical capacity and still get by pretty well as long as our brains are relatively intact. And so it does seem to be the case that the brain aging aspect is slower compared to other aspects of our physical aging. And that seems true for all humans.
Yeah, and I mean, I was going to say in terms of our orthopedic health, I mean, the health of our muscles, bones, etc. I guess that in our more modern industrialized societies, we tend to have the issue of people underusing their bodies. They don't move around enough. But in the case of more traditional societies, perhaps, and maybe in our own societies, we also see that with athletes, or at least professional athletes, some of them, perhaps in more traditional societies, they perhaps in some cases at least they would have the opposite issue. Perhaps they overuse their bodies or misuse them in some ways, right?
Yeah. So for example, we've done studies of bone mineral density, and it's true that men in particular have higher bone mineral density in traditional subsistence populations, compared to, say, the West, where we're more sedentary. But it's not terribly different for women. So even though women in subsistence societies are a lot more physically active, they also, if it's a natural fertility population or context, they're having a lot of children. And especially if those children are more kind of closely spaced together, and that's sort of having an impact on your bone mineral density that kind of counterbalances the fact that they're more physically active. So the net effect is actually that an American woman age 35, her bone mineral density doesn't look terribly different than a Chimane woman age 35. So yeah, I mean that's exactly right. That there's, even though we're in some ways we're healthier, but there's a lot of ways for things to kind of go wrong, and again goes back to just basic physical activity and sedentary activity too. Right now I'm sitting on a chair, and I'm not sitting in a way that, like, I'm not using any core muscles right now to maintain my balance. And if I do that enough, yeah, I do think I'll be more prone to injury, and my bone mineral density is probably gonna winnow away. Yeah.
So earlier you were saying, for example, that when it comes to, I think you mentioned heart disease, that we see lower rates of heart disease in older people in traditional societies. But are chronic diseases that are common in industrialized societies, like heart disease, diabetes, cancer, dementia, inevitable?
Yeah. Well, that's, I think, some of the hopeful message of some of my work and my colleagues' work that work with like more subsistence oriented populations is they don't seem to be inevitable. Right? Because the very fact that not just one or two, extraordinary athletic, health conscious people avoided heart disease, right? We have those people in our society. But kind of writ large, the vast majority of the population didn't get heart disease, and they're much more likely to die of something else. That shows that prevention really, can be very critical, and that it's not inevitable. So and that's sort of been one of the things that we've learned from a lot of this work. It's not inevitable that your blood pressure has to always increase with age. It's not inevitable that testosterone declines rapidly with age. It's not inevitable that, your prostate is going to get larger with age. These are all things that we've kind of found from different studies. It's not inevitable that, you'll get diabetes or Alzheimer's. And so that it does suggest that there are possible things we could do. And maybe that gets us to that last question about, what can we do? What can we learn? And obviously we're not all going to become hunter-gatherers, right? Not only is it not feasible, it probably isn't something that most of us would want, right? A hunting and gathering life is very difficult life. And so there's a reason why, hunter-gatherers don't exercise, right? Why would they? They move their body when they have to. They move their body because if they don't move their body, they're not going to eat that day. And so it makes sense that we sort of evolved to conserve energy, and that if you could drive to the supermarket, you're going to do so, rather than like this go out of your way to walk and carry like 20 pounds of food. No one really does that unless it's something they consciously put themselves towards. But it's almost like fighting evolution, because we've evolved in ways to sort of conserve energy, to consume energy when it's available. to consume dense packets of energy when it's available, and to enjoy the flavor of fatty, sugary foods and all that would have been in limited supply. And so much of what we have to do to stay healthy in a land of abundance is avoid things that sort of come somewhat naturally to us. We have to fight our instincts. And that's what becomes really, really hard. And, I think there's no easy solution to that other than, there's no easy solution. I think the solution has to be, we have to shift the incentives. We have to shift the structure of how our societies are organized so that the easiest options are healthier options, right? If you build housing in relation to a livable situation, so everyone can kind of walk to a market, that already makes a huge difference. That everyone can walk and do their food shopping as opposed to kind of needing cars all the time. If you make it such that, at eye level, the healthy foods in the market compared to the unhealthy foods, little things like that can go a long way towards, nudging us towards healthier lifestyles, I think, can make a big difference.
Yeah, I imagine that if hunter-gatherers came to our industrialized societies and saw people at the gym running on the treadmill and lifting weights, they would be like, what the heck? What are you doing with that?
Yeah, the very fact, like, what are these torture machines? Why do these exist? And why are people doing this? Like, it's just, I remember for the longest time, like, at the very least, why aren't these exercise machines like hooked into the grid, at least generate the electricity that's powering the gym? And apparently, some gyms have started doing that, and you can reduce your monthly fee because you're helping keep the lights on. That at least it makes sense. You can feel like you're being productive in a way that you're actually helping, doing something rather than just like mindlessly doing this. But that's okay. Fine. We need this because our lifestyle is such that, we tend to be more sedentary. But I still think even like with the gym, so many people buy their gym memberships on December 31st, right? And then by January 2nd, they already like aren't really going. And apparently just buying the membership doesn't make you healthy. You actually do have to go. But I think even something as simple as like buying memberships like in pairs, having a buddy to go to the gym with makes a huge difference. Now you've made it a social activity and you're more likely to go. You're more likely to have someone make you go, and you vice versa. And, maybe the hanging out and conversation becomes primary and the working out is just secondary. Again, another way of sort of nudging ourselves to being healthier, even in the sort of artificial way of relying on gyms.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me ask you this question. So, do you think it's possible to say, at least on average, whether, let's say, a 65-year-old, because that's usually the age that medical institutions, the WHO, and so on, use to define old age? Do we know if a 65-year-old person living in a traditional society, a contemporary traditional society, or a traditional society from the past, would be healthier than a 65-year-old living in a contemporary industrialized society, or vice versa? Is it possible to say that?
Yeah, that's sort of like the $10 million question. And that also kind of motivated a lot of my work early on, like really basic question. And, 20 some years later, I do have a better answer maybe than before, but it's certainly not an easy answer because on certain aspects, like the ability to walk 8 miles and do work, I do think we're probably maybe a little bit less healthy than we would have been.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, I do think our ability to sort of withstand a variety of assaults in our environment is better. And so our ability to survive infection is better a 65-year-old in our society now compared to, say, what probably would have been the case in the past. And so I think our reserve in a way is better now than in the past. And we, the shorthand for that is just that so life expectancy, when you asked me that question, I don't know, it feels like 3 hours ago or 20 minutes ago. What I told you was life expectancy at birth, but you can calculate a life expectancy at any age. So the life expectancy at 65, it could be, it's how many years do you expect to live if you've made it to 65?
Mm-hmm.
And just based on that alone, that number is larger now than it ever was before, right? So it might be like 15 years or 20 years, but in the past, that might have been like 5 years or 8 years. So now it's not just that you're more likely to get struck by lightning in the past compared to now, that it is probably something about your health and well-being and your ability to withstand different assaults and recover from infection and all that stuff that is contributing to, a doubling of the life expectancy at age 65. And so, I would argue that, yeah, I think we are healthier on average from what we even take into account, that we're more likely to be obese, we're more likely to have diabetes, we're more likely to have a variety of these chronic diseases. But as a whole, I think for the things that kind of matter in the most practical way, we're better off now than we were in the past at age 65.
Do you think that in our contemporary industrialized societies, we perhaps are exposed to some evolutionary mismatches, in the sense that, for example, we have easy access to high caloric food, we have easy access to sugary food, salty food, we have the way we tend to move around, is not usually by foot, but using motor vehicles. And the kinds of jobs that we have, we tend to be sitting most of the time. So do you think that some of those things, if we're approaching aging and health from an evolutionary perspective, are evolutionary mismatches?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the common framework for thinking about a lot of the chronic diseases of aging, right? That and for some of these like newer types of diseases and morbidities, that our genome didn't evolve in the particular context in which we live now. But I think it's usually not so straightforward, because certainly if you're 75 and you have arthritis and you have a hard time getting around, well, having a car that you can still drive to get yourself to where you need to go is still a benefit, right?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, over reliance on cars to the point where your body is never moving, that's where certain things can be taken to an extreme. So it's really how we kind of use some of those technologies, rather than like the whole environment is kind of thrown out of whack. Because certainly plenty of people still manage to move their bodies and get lots of physical activity, and not just because they kind of go to the gym. In fact, in many ways, I think, city living is effective for lots of reasons, but, if nothing else, people are moving around and walking. It's not as, you can't find parking and it's expensive. So, you're using public transportation and you're walking a lot. And so you're getting more steps per day. And, the higher physical activity that, groups like, the Chimane and Hadza get, it's not because they're running vigorous half marathons every day. It's a lot of light and moderate activity that they're engaged in, which is a hopeful message to us, right? Because that I think we can all handle light and moderate activity. We all wouldn't want to run marathons. And so that's sort of attainable, light and moderate activity. And, the epidemiological studies sort of show this, that at any activity level, if you're fairly sedentary, improving and just walking a little bit more makes a big difference. In fact, it makes more of a difference if you're inactive than if you're already really physically active and you add a couple thousand steps. So yeah, I think those are hopeful messages for us moving forward.
Let me ask you, because this is something that in psychology, I guess social psychology specifically, people talk a lot about. People talk a lot about how in older age there's that sort of late age contentment, that older people tend to be more content, tend to suffer less from depression, for example, than the younger people. Is late age contentment a human universal? I mean, do we also see that in traditional societies?
Yeah, another good question. And I think this is one of those cases where I think in some ways the mismatch works to our advantage, not to our disadvantage. Most of the time we hear about mismatch where something, because it's quite literally defined that way, our health is poor because our genome doesn't match the conditions under which that genome evolved. But in this particular case, so studying late age kind of contentment, life satisfaction, happiness, well-being, put all this under the umbrella of well-being. And yeah, I know the psychologists, they care about which terms are used. Contentment is a little bit different than your momentary happiness. But still, thinking about well-being overall, on average, yeah, older people in many places around the world tend to, coming off of a midlife kind of slump, that they become more content with age, right? And, in some ways this might make sense, right? You learn, maybe you become a little bit less competitive, a little bit less ambitious. You learn not to sweat the small things. Maybe you
perhaps they don't care too much about people's opinions anymore.
Oh, right. The fact that you don't care so much, your reputation is established already. You're not jockeying for status. You can focus on the positive, a little bit less on the negative. You gain perspective, if you want to call it wisdom. All of these things are things I think matter, that can improve our outlook and improve our well-being. And what's remarkable about that is that if that's improving with age, that's happening at the same time that our physical health is actually declining. Yet healthy body, healthy mind, all else equal, being healthier makes you happier. So in spite of suffering from more physical ailments, we actually seem to get more content with age. And even more so, if you also consider what's happening with age, kids are fledging the nest. If you live long enough, you're going to start seeing everyone around you die. And so again, these social losses, combined with your physical health decline, yet in spite of all that, you've got improved well-being. So I think that's pretty remarkable. And now, but it is a little bit variable. Even in the West, sometimes well-being increases throughout life. Sometimes you do see it sort of flatten out in the 70s. And so I do think there is this sort of trade-off. Shit is happening that is not good in your life. And to what extent is it offset by other things? And this is the case where if you live under a context where you have labor-saving technologies, you have a car, you have health insurance, you have disability checks coming in. So, there's a sort of institutional buffering that allows you to still have an income and still get by, then, maybe it's a net positive and you can be content. But in traditional contexts, even this is where it was, to many, I think, surprising, because we tend to think, well, in small scale societies, everyone's surrounded by family and it takes a village and people are cooperative.
Yeah, the social aspect of our lives, we tend to think that it's more taken care of in traditional societies than in contemporary industrialized societies.
Yeah, but it might be a double-edged sword, is because you are embedded in these networks. When I talked about the 85-year-old grandmother compared to the 65-year-old grandmother, and if you feel like you're a burden, now all of a sudden you're a burden to all these people in your network, and that doesn't feel good. And so I think in what we found is just a whole lot more variability in well-being at later ages. Sometimes you see those improvements like you see in the West, but more often than not, you either see no relationship with age or you see the opposite, like things are getting worse with age. And I just think that that's maybe more typical in a context where your physical health is sort of primary for making a living, for being useful to others, where there's no cars to drive you around and no Ubers to move your body from here to there. And so that aspects of physicality becomes really critical, and that ability of being useful to others becomes really critical. I mean, it's true in our society. No one wants to think of themselves as a burden. No one wants to feel that they're not useful to other people. But maybe it becomes a little bit less necessary here because you still can have a viable livelihood, even if you kind of live alone. So yeah, I think, that aspect is a little bit more surprising, both that one, in small scale societies, everyone's not happy at late ages. And if anything, those people might be the most miserable at the latest ages.
Yeah, maybe we will find out that in industrialized societies, at least, people get more content in older age because they actually do not fear death, but ever living for so long, they're like, oh my God, finally, this is coming over. Finally, I'm in the last 100 meters of the marathon.
Yeah, I think so. Well, we certainly have a big culture that kind of focuses on these things, and yeah. No, it's a good question, and I do think it's sort of what we need to understand better, because ultimately, yeah, we do want to improve our survival and live longer, but we want a happy life. We want a healthy life. We want to be content, and if that's ultimately what matters most, well, we should be studying that a lot more systematically than we are just whether you're alive or dead at a given age. So.
Okay, so I have just two more questions I want to ask you. Let's talk a little bit about retirement, because of course we have retirement in contemporary industrialized societies, but what about traditional societies? Is there such a thing as retirement there? And what are the effects of retirement for old people?
Yeah. So, short answer, no. There is no retirement. Like no formal retirement like the way we think of it, like you reach a target age and then you no longer work. That doesn't exist. And so that's also, a bit of a mismatch. And even more so a mismatch, because when 65 was placed as an arbitrary age, at least in the US, that was occurring at a time where that was already older than our life expectancy. right? And now that's well below our life expectancy. And so the question about, should we have formal retirement? And then secondarily, if so, at what age? These are going to be questions that are going to be part of the national conversation. If we are younger at 65 than we used to be, then should we be retiring at all at age 65? Maybe that should be 70 or 75. And so those questions are going to come out. But and especially I think, in small scale traditional societies, even though I said you're not formally retiring, it doesn't mean that people are still doing the same things until they die. There is a shift in what people are doing. And so people will still try to be useful and participate in a lot of different activities, but they might not be doing some of the really physically intensive ones. So Chimani men, for example, they're not really using axes and chopping down really thick trees, when they're in their 70s. They still might chop down little trees, and with the machete, they might still do a lot of clearing in their field, but they're not doing sort of the heavy physical labor. And they're not hunting as well, right? And not just their physical strength declining, but if your ability to see and particularly your ability to hear become compromised, then your ability to be an effective hunter just kind of goes out the window. So yeah, those things are changing, but there's a lot of other ways of being useful that people find to keep active and still be included, still participate, not just in the economy, but into the politics and the social scene in small scale society. So in other words, they're still relevant. Whereas in our society, because work is life, oftentimes once you're retired, people actually get really depressed sometimes. There's a little spike in mortality after retirement because people don't know what to do with themselves. Granted, that's not always the case, right? Some people are thrilled once they retire and they can do all the things that they held back. But this idea that you retire and then all of a sudden your life becomes one focused on leisure, that didn't exist throughout, our history. And, and I think that's part, the last couple of chapters in my book kind of focus on that aspect that, rethinking that because, the burden of population aging, maybe that could be flipped on its head to, as more of an untapped potential, but not if everyone is just focused on their leisure. But if instead they're kind of focused on, how can I still contribute? What are all the different ways I can contribute? That dependency ratio and all those other aspects that are seen as problems in an aging society, maybe those things wouldn't exist in the same way.
Yeah, and I guess that at the same time, maybe we can also put things in perspective here, right? Because it's not, we tend to think as having an occupation or doing something useful in our societies as being the same as having a salaried job. But there are many people that even if they are retired, they're still doing useful things and practical things. They're taking care of their grandchildren, they're doing housework, and so on and so forth. It's not just because you don't have a salaried job that you can't be useful in society. Right.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, it's all the, certainly in hunter-gatherer societies, just same way that we focus on income, you could focus on calories, and those are just one aspect of contribution. And what really matters, right, or if it's impacts on fitness and well-being, for our purposes, money is just one way of being productive. And even better, right, if you can get Social Security, you could still have some income coming in with the ability to then either generate more income from doing other services, and of course just all the other things that older people could do as well that made contributions. And one difference though, what you could say is, making these contributions to society, where society is sort of like this vague thing. Maybe community is easier to think about, family is easier to think about, but we also have smaller families than we ever had before, and some of those families that, when we do have them, they tend to live far away, which makes it more difficult. But it doesn't mean that urge to sort of be seen as valuable and useful, it's still there. And yeah, money doesn't have to be, the language in which one judges your utility. And so even, people make contributions to their church. They volunteer in schools. There's so many different ways to kind of feel useful and feel like you're making a difference. And in a way that not only does an older person feel more accomplished and better about themselves and their own well-being, and it motivates them to be healthier when they feel their life has purpose, but it's usually improving someone else's life, right? If you're helping at a school, you're building literacy, you're reducing, teenage delinquency and all that stuff. So this is why it's been argued where if we can improve the contributions and the ability for elders to really contribute to the extent that they want to, that it's a win-win for society. But our society isn't really structured that way quite yet, right? If you can no longer drive, then you can't get to where those schools are. If you live in a rural area where there's no public transportation, then you don't have an ability to get from where you live to where that need might be. And so again, this is the sort of rethinking about how can we build upon the untapped strengths of our elder population to help contribute to society.
Okay, so one last question then, and I guess that over the course of our conversation, we've already addressed this question in different ways, at least indirectly, but do you think that even with our evolutionary mismatches, some of them negative, some of them positive, as we talked about here, that we as people who live in industrialized societies can learn something from how people age in more traditional societies that we could apply ourselves?
Yeah, I think we touched upon this a little bit, right? We can't become hunter-gatherers, but then one of the lessons is, nor do we, I think we even want to. But there are certain lessons, right? From little to large, like on the physical activity front, right? That's the one commonality to all small-scale subsistence populations. People are fairly physically active. We know that physical activity, in some ways, is the best non-drug drug that we have, and it's free. Everyone can afford it, and it doesn't have to involve gyms. It can be involved just walking around your neighborhood. And so being more physically active and in ways that don't necessarily require athletic equipment, I think is one big lesson, and just trying to incorporate it into your life as a lifestyle rather than as a exercise activity. No one wants to, well, I speak maybe for myself, no one likes, like, I'm going to go exercise now. It's like a chore, versus, I have to go pick up my prescription, or I have to go to Trader Joe's and get some food. So I'm just going to walk there. And so I think that mentality is important. I think there's other things about, it's easy to get caught on various, competitive treadmills and focused on minutia in ways that just increase our stress. They increase our stress, and they also erode our sleep. So we don't really sleep as well as we could. We're staring into screens. and disrupted sleep, messes up your circadian rhythms. It messes up your immune system. It messes up almost everything, your vascular system. Whereas, a lot of hunter gatherers, they're tired, they go to sleep, and so I think, again, there's kind of very practical kind of lessons of just trying to extract the positives of our technology in our current environment while minimizing those harms. I do think one lesson about the diverse types of diets that hunter-gatherers have had maybe means don't overstress about what you're eating. If you're, at the level of there's a couple rules of thumb. More fiber, good. Zero fiber, bad, right? So like empty carbs, processed sugar, added sugar as an ingredient in things, bad. Less of that, good. As opposed to does everything have to have a paleo label of approval? Am I eating, the right this, that, and the other thing? To the extent that, like Michael Pollan's, advice of, if your grandmother wouldn't recognize, the ingredients, then maybe don't go for that. But again, if nothing else, also just eating less than you otherwise might. And, one way I think of maybe it helps doing that is to the extent that if we eat socially and not while we're watching TV and mindlessly just kind of shoveling food in, you're probably less likely to overeat. So, that kind of, people want to call that mindfulness, mindful eating, that can make a difference. But, all those are sort of little lessons about how we can sort of capture some of the healthy aspects of hunter-gatherer lifestyles without being hunter-gatherers. I do think there's probably another set of lessons that are a little bit harder to incorporate, but, on the infectious side of things, most infections are bad, but certainly hunter-gatherer microbiome, gut microbiome, is a lot more diverse than our more industrialized microbiome. Hunter-gatherers have a richer, more diverse set of pathogens that they've been exposed to. And one hypothesis is that their immune systems are better regulated than ours. And so they're less prone to autoimmune disease, but also might be less prone to other ways that our immune systems can go awry. I mean, heart disease, in effect, is, partly due to the way our immune systems, attack our own, little tears in our arteries, right? The way that inflammation is actively involved in part of that whole atherosclerotic process. And, maybe hunter-gatherer immune systems aren't working in the same kind of way that affects those systems in a harmful way. And so since our immune systems were designed to sort of attack pathogens, if our immune systems are a bit awry, well, that suggests we really need to work hard to make sure that our immune systems are better regulated. And one way that can maybe occur is maybe not obsessing so much with, hygienic, super clean environments. The 5-second rule of if food has been on the floor for 5 seconds. I tend to have a 5-minute rule personally.
Oh my God.
Hey, but I'm healthy so far, as far as I know. Yeah, so there's little things. I mean, obviously, it's a nice balance, right? You don't want to, expose an infant, needlessly to harm, but at the same time, you don't want to be so sheltered and protected that you don't build those defenses. Your armies can go awry if they're not well trained, and so even having your kids in daycare exposes them to lots of childhood other infections in ways that if they're kept at home, and exclusively, that they might increase the likelihood of having weird allergies or, food allergies. I mean, who had nasty, deathly, nut allergies, 50 years ago? I mean, those are things that are much newer now than the past, and we know it has to do something with our immune systems, and so that's still a work in progress, because you want to be able to add, resilience, but you don't want to increase danger, right? So people shouldn't be out infecting themselves left and right in the hopes that, because we just don't know enough, and immune systems are so individualized that there's not a single magic bullet that works equally well for everybody. But I do think we can be a little bit practical there, like, don't bombard your system with antibiotics unless you really have to. And there's good rules of thumb about, those kinds of things. You treat an infection, fever. Well, if it's 104, you probably should treat that fever. If it's 99 degrees Fahrenheit, wait and see. That's almost nothing. So I think there's a lot of those kinds of lessons. Hunter-gatherers are also intensely social. I think, again, some of these health fitness circles, a lot of dialogue is on like what to do with our individual bodies as, individual agents making decisions. But, hunter-gatherers are so intensely social, that to the extent that, our social lives, a healthy social life, I think, feel like it lends itself to just being motivated to eat healthy and to move your body and to do all these things. And yet that's not something you can easily prescribe. Like, take 2 pills and add 2 friends at the end of the day. Like, and so we don't know how to do that as well as all the other things. And yet it's such a key aspect of well-being that I think we do need to put a lot more attention to our social lives. And that's something that hunter-gatherers do all the time. I don't know. That's a kind of laundry list of things, the easy things, I think, that we can implement in our lives to sort of capture some of the healthier aspects of hunter-gatherer lives.
Okay, so Dr. Gurven, one of the things that I certainly implement is when I start to get tired, I go to sleep, and it's already 7 p.m. here in Portugal, and I'm a morning person. So in a few minutes, my brain will start to shut down slowly. So let's perhaps wrap up our conversation here. And the book is, again, 7 Decades, How We Evolved to Live Longer. I'm leaving a link to it in the description of the interview. And Dr. Gurven, apart from the book, where can people find you and your work on the internet?
Well, there aren't very many Gurvens out there in the world. So even if you just put Gurven, Gurven, you'll probably find my website. I post, all of our publications on there, and gives you a little bit more information about me and the work in my lab. I think there's some YouTube videos out there, probably some talks. I think it's the easiest way. My email address is on there if people want to get in contact. The book can be found pretty much, I hope, anywhere you enjoy buying books. Should be available. So thank you, Ricardo. This was a lot of fun. In fact, I'm seeing now over 2 hours. So it flew by. So that means it was good. Great questions, great conversation, and thank you.
No, thank you so much for doing this. It was an immense pleasure. Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Muller, Hans Fredrik Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingford, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stantanti, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Allman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Errington, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismael Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugnik, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.